Did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do, just because you were easy to blame?
At Thanksgiving, my mother looked straight at me in front of my brother, my sister, their spouses, and a pile of polite smiles, and said, with that patient voice she uses when she thinks she is teaching me how the world works, that this conversation was for families with children and I would not get it, and I laughed a little because that is what you do when someone throws a dart at your chest during a holiday and calls it an observation, while my mind did the math of how many times we have had this exact message wrapped in a different bow. I could feel the whole table shift in that tiny way people shift when something a little mean slides out and nobody wants to look like they noticed, and Melissa started telling a story about her kid's teacher as if to hustle the room forward. And Jason chimed in about youth sports like he was backing his quarterback, and I nodded along and passed a dish I did not want to pass, because if I said anything then it would turn into the old theater of you are too sensitive and you always make everything about you, which is convenient for everyone who would rather not look at what was actually said. I am not anti-children and never have been, and they all know that, but in my family the gold star gets stapled to whoever is reproducing, and if you are not doing that then your life becomes a side quest the main characters tolerate. And when my mother said it so cleanly, so public and matter-of-fact, I felt that quiet click you feel when a line stops being a pattern and becomes a decision point. The same click I felt last year when I brought dessert and she told me to leave it in the kitchen, because the kids will not eat anything fancy. I kept smiling because that is the rule here, you keep the room comfortable even if your own face is burning, and I let Melissa brag about a school fundraiser like she was closing a tech merger. And I let Jason tease me about being the only one who could travel on a whim because I have nothing tying me down, and I let my mother ask me once again if I had thought about freezing my eggs. All of it landing like rain that you cannot stop but can definitely step out of, and I thought about how I always show up on time, bring things people like, help with dishes, offer to watch the kids so someone else can rest, and the only bill I cannot pay in this house is the one where I have to buy respect with a baby I do not have. There is a way I used to respond to this, and I could hear it loading in my throat, the speech about how adults do not become more valuable when they become parents, and how I am not a waiting room for a life that has not started. But I have given that speech and it never lands because I am playing chess with people who think the only legal piece is a stroller, and I am tired of being told that I do not understand fatigue, loyalty, or real love, as if those things are household memberships instead of human skills. So I reached for a different move, which was silence. Not the silence kind that sits there and bleeds out, but the kind you choose when you do not want to hand your dignity over for sport, and I let the noise of the table roll on without me. And if anyone noticed that I went a little quiet, they pretended they did not, because noticing would mean asking why, and asking why would mean facing the sentence my mother had just laid down like law. My dad, who mostly floats above these skirmishes like a balloon that chooses not to pop, told a story about the year he worked double shifts and still managed to assemble a bike on Christmas Eve, and everyone clapped like it was a performance. And I clapped too because I love my dad and it is not his fault that he thinks the safest place for him is the middle of the road, and I swallowed the old wish that he would say something, anything, to slow the scraping sound of my mother's judgment. Wish as old as middle school and just as useless. I knew what would come later, the little messages that try to translate cruelty into advice, the soft demands that I should not take things personally, the casual audit of my choices disguised as concern. And I pictured the family group chat that always lights up after gatherings, where the same 4 people repeat the same 3 topics and I am expected to applaud from the audience and be grateful when the spotlight lands on me for one polite minute. Under the table my phone buzzed and I ignored it, and above the table I poured coffee and helped clear plates and asked Melissa about her daycare waitlist like a good sport. And while I was collecting cups my mother squeezed my elbow and told me she worries I will wake up one day and realize I missed my window, and I smiled because the only thing worse than being insulted in this house is making a scene about it. And she walked away convinced she had delivered wisdom instead of the same old cut. On the drive home, I did the thing where I let the car hold the conversation I do not want to have with any of them, and I admitted to myself that I am furious, not just because the sentence hurt, but because it is the shorthand for a whole worldview that keeps me auditioning for a role I never agreed to play, and in that fury there was also a small spark of something that felt cleaner than anger. A spark that said I do not have to keep debating people who refuse to see me unless I perform a part they wrote. I thought about the holidays I have watched other people design for themselves without permission slips, the way grown adults pick up and go somewhere when they are tired of being told who they should be. And I finally let myself admit that I wanted to do something that was not a speech, not a lecture, not a PowerPoint on boundaries, but a move that would not ask for agreement. A move that would just exist in the world and make its point without me standing there holding a sign. By the time I reached my apartment, the group chat had already bloomed with the usual photos and commentary, and there was my mother's caption about how wonderful it is to have a house full of children because that is what life is about. And I stared at that line for a long minute, not because I disagree that children are wonderful, but because I finally accepted that I am done being graded against a standard that was never mine, and my stomach stopped twisting and my shoulders went down and a very simple idea slid into place like a key finding its lock. I did not call anyone, I did not write a long text, and I did not draft the perfect clap back, because I suddenly understood that they cannot hear my words when they are married to their template of me, and so I opened my laptop. And I looked at the places I used to scroll past because they felt like something other people get to do, and I thought about what it would mean to put my money, my time, and my energy where my mouth would usually be, and to let an action speak in a language even people who do not respect me cannot ignore. I am not saying I knew exactly what that action would be in that second, but I knew the shape of it, and I knew it would be unmistakable and calm and not up for debate. And as the chat pinged with my sister's photos of leftovers and my brother's joke about his expanding waistband, I closed the app, pulled my card from my wallet, and hovered over a decision that was going to say everything I wanted to say without me raising my voice. Which is why the next time their phones lit up, it was not going to be me asking for a seat at their table. On the drive home, I rehearsed every speech I used to give and threw them out one by one, because if there is one lesson I have learned with my family, it is that a perfect sentence does nothing when the room is committed to misunderstanding you. So instead of crafting another careful explanation of why my life is not a placeholder, I decided to put my energy into an action that would not request permission, could not be reinterpreted as whining, and would answer the sentence my mother delivered, with a response that was quiet, elegant, and irreversible, which is how I ended up at my kitchen table with my laptop open, my card on the placemat, and that humming mix of anger and relief that shows up when you finally admit you are going to do something different. I told myself this was not about showing off and that I owed no one a justification, yet because old habits die hard, I still did the mental audit in case anyone tried to make me feel reckless, ticking through the overtime I worked this quarter, the extra project I took when my manager was out, the miles I have banked from company travel, the points sitting there like a permission slip I never cashed, and the babysitting hours I have clocked for Melissa and Jason on last-minute notice when date nights and weekend tournaments magically mattered more than the plans I had already made, and once I laid out that private ledger it felt less like indulgence and more like a refund, not from a person, but from a life I keep bailing out without interest. I typed adults-only resorts into the search bar, and yes, I did clock the irony as it landed. Because if my mother's standard for value is families with children, then the opposite of begging for a seat at that table is choosing a table where children are lovely in theory and completely absent in practice. Not because I dislike kids, but because I needed one weekend where I was not the default helper, the emergency contact, the extra pair of hands, and there it was on the screen, a 5-star place that had always lived in the part of my brain labeled someday, with a weekend opening that matched the only thing on my calendar, which was a recurring reminder that says protect your peace, and even though I am not a crystals person, I took that as a sign. The price tag made my heart skip, not because I could not afford it, but because spending on myself at that level still trips the alarm my upbringing installed. The one that says be modest and be useful and remember there is always someone who needs you to be practical, and then I remembered how often modesty is code for keep yourself small so we do not have to adjust, and I entered my card numbers. Applied points until the total dipped into a range that felt both responsible and thrilling. Added a note for a late dinner seating on Saturday because I wanted to be unhurried for once in my life, and when the confirmation email landed, I sat back in the chair with that odd, private grin you get when you realize you have just done something that cannot be undone and that no one gets to vote on. I wish I could say the story ends there with a neat bow and a moral about self-care, but the truth is that booking the trip lit up every battleground inside me, because right on schedule came the urge to explain. To text Melissa and say I would not be available for Saturday babysitting if she needed it, to pre-apologize to Jason in case he wanted help with his garage cleanout, to send my mother a message that framed the weekend as restorative and not an attack. And I almost did all of that. Until I realized that explaining would be me stepping right back into the classroom where I have to prove that I am a good student before I am allowed to live my life. So I put my phone face down and reminded myself that other adults make plans all the time without sending a committee memo. Still, I am strategic by nature, and I wanted this to be more than a private victory, not because I need their approval but because emotional justice, when it is done right, is not just a hug you give yourself. It is also a mirror you hold up so the people who cut you can see the line on their own hands, which is why I opened the family album on my phone and created a new shared section labeled Weekend Highlights, a friendly title with no commentary attached. And I set the permissions so that when I posted to that album, the group chat would ping with the automated preview, meaning I did not have to craft a caption or a pitch. I just had to live and let the receipts arrive with their own neutral voice. I booked a spa appointment I've wanted for years and a chef's tasting for Saturday night that came with a tiny note about a surprise course. And I arranged late checkout on Sunday because there is something quietly radical about not rushing back from peace like it is a crime scene, and then I called my bank to confirm travel so nobody could later claim I had been irresponsible and triggered a freeze. And even though none of that is glamorous, it is the kind of groundwork that makes a plan calm and undeniable, which is the tone I wanted the whole weekend to carry. When Melissa texted that she might need me for a few hours on Saturday because their sitter was flaky, I looked at the screen and felt the old reflex reach for the yes that always proves I am a team player. And then I wrote back with a single sentence that felt like freedom dressed as common sense, telling her that I would be out of town and suggesting she ask Jason since he is already home that day, and I left it at that without cushioning or guilt. Which may not sound like revenge to someone who has never lived in my family's economy, but to me it was the first clean swing, a refusal to subsidize the very people who tell me my life is light. By midnight my bag was half packed, my confirmation emails were in a folder, my calendar was blocked like any other grown professional blocks a business trip. And the only open question was whether I would post anything at all or simply let the quiet be the message. And then I remembered my mother's line about conversations for families with children and heard the unspoken punchline that has always followed it, that my stories do not matter because they do not include diapers and school schedules. So I decided I would share exactly one photo at exactly one time with exactly one short line that would not beg, would not fight, and would not blink, and the moment I set that plan, the weekend stopped being a getaway and became a move, which is why, when my phone buzzed with the family thread the next morning, I smiled without opening it and thought, give it one day, and then press send. I woke up on Saturday with the steadiness that follows a hard decision, and instead of slipping back into the reflex of checking the family thread to gauge the mood before I set my own, I put my phone on a weekend focus that lets calls from work emergencies through and quietly sends everyone else to a holding pen. Because if this move was going to mean anything, it had to be built on the kind of uninterrupted attention I usually reserve for other people's needs, and by the time I was in the car headed to the airport, I could feel the old urge to narrate my choices to the family softening into something calmer and more private. A feeling that did not ask for applause and did not fear criticism. It just asked me to keep going. Travel has never been the hard part for me, because I can follow instructions and show up on time and make a plan that survives delays, which is probably why I have become the family's unofficial logistics department. But there was a difference in the way I moved through the morning that even I could not pretend was ordinary, a difference that sounded like my own name spoken by the concierge without anyone else's itinerary attached. And while I am not going to decorate this with poetic details, because that is not what this is about, I will say that the first moment I realized I had not heard a single child's cry or a request for help with a high chair or a reminder to share was the first moment I understood how many of my weekends have been built around being useful, and how little practice I have at being unnecessary, and that realization did not make me feel selfish. It made me feel like I was finally breathing with the full set of lungs I was born with. I kept my plan simple, not because I am simple but because I have learned that simplicity is the sharpest blade when you want a message to cut clean. So I checked in, confirmed the chef's tasting for the evening, walked the property only far enough to know where I would sit later with a glass and a book I did not open, and then I did something I never do on family weekends, which was nothing at all for an hour, not the kind of nothing that is a pause between chores, the kind of nothing that is a refusal to carry anyone for a few steps just because you are strong enough to do it, and in that hour I arranged the pieces of the move the way you lay out clothes on a bed before a big day, not for the look but for the order. I reopened the shared album I had set up and tested the notification flow with a harmless photo of a menu from the lobby cafe, watched the preview card appear in the group chat without my having to type a single word. And once I knew the pipe worked, I deleted the test and set the stage for the real thing, which was not going to be a parade of selfies or a running commentary, because I am not trying to sell anyone on my happiness like a timeshare. It was going to be one image at the exact moment. Their Saturday night slows down and the phones come out. One image that says I am here, I am fine, and I did not need a panel vote to live well. There was a brief wobble around mid-afternoon when Melissa texted me directly to ask if I had a second to talk, because the sitter situation had imploded and she was drowning. And I stared at the screen and felt that muscle memory that has kept me in the family winner's circle for years, the part of me that can always find a ride, a slot, a stopgap, and then I pictured the sentence my mother had delivered on Thursday. The sentence that drew a circle and put me outside it, and I remembered that if I am permanently excluded when it serves them, I do not need to be permanently available when it serves them, so I wrote back with a kind line that acknowledged her stress and reiterated that I was out of town. And I suggested a practical alternative that did not involve me, and I put the phone down before the guilt machine could crank up and reframe my boundaries as a character flaw. By early evening the tasting was confirmed, my seat was held, and my plan for the album caption was finally clear. Not a clapback and not a thesis, just a line that could ride under a photo and do the work without my voice straining. Something that said what needed to be said in the tone I wanted to keep, and after trying a handful of options that sounded smug or brittle or too clever by half, I landed on a sentence that fit the shape of the weekend and the argument I am always being forced to have. A sentence that did not insult anyone and did not beg for understanding. A sentence that simply refused to apologize for its own existence, which is how I came to reservations set and notifications calibrated. The quiet thrill of a plan that has finally matured into action running under my skin like a low drumbeat. I ate without rushing, because the point of this was not to jam-proof into the hours, and while I will not romanticize a plate because that is not who I am and that is not what this story is, I will admit that being addressed as a whole adult whose preferences mattered was a kind of relief I had not clocked as rare until I felt it, and when the surprise course arrived with a small card that used my name again, just my name and not a role, I understood that this weekend was less about luxury. Then it was about the foreignness of being the only person I had to consider, and that understanding steadied my hands when I finally unlocked my phone to line up the post. The photo I chose was unremarkable in the way that makes it undeniable, no sweeping view and no staged pose. Just a clean shot of the tasting list with a glass at the edge and the corner of the place setting that proves you are not standing at a counter grabbing something between kids' bedtimes. And I typed the caption that had landed an hour earlier and read it again for temperature. Then I sent it not as a text, but to the shared album so the system would carry it into their thread without my name at the top like a flare, and I watched the tiny progress line slide to the end and turn solid, and in the second before the preview card hit their phones I switched my focus back on to protect my peace from the first wave. Because whatever they wrote next belonged to tomorrow, while the last thing belonging to tonight was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when they saw it, they would hear it without me having to say a word. The preview card hit their phones exactly when I wanted it to, which I only confirmed the next morning after I let myself sleep in without the phantom weight of being on call for other people's needs. And when I finally slid the focus off and opened the thread, it was already a quilt of hot takes and soft jabs, and the kind of thin praise that wears a polite sweater over jealousy. With my mother leading the parade by typing that she was proud I was taking time to relax because self-care matters. But then immediately tacking on a reminder that budgets are real and that it is easy to spend when you have no dependents, while Melissa chimed in with that brittle humor she wears when she is asking for something, saying must be nice to have a weekend without a schedule. And Jason, never one to miss a chance to play the comedian, wanted to know if I had found a secret sponsor or if my company was footing the bill, which would have been an actual question if he had asked it like a question. Rather. Then a nudge that wanted me to explain myself so he could feel better that I had not somehow done something he is not allowed to do. The spouses did their usual chorus, with Melissa's husband offering a backhanded compliment about how the presentation looked fancy for someone who always says she does not care about fancy things, and Jason's wife dropping a line about how they have not had a dinner like that since before the kids and maybe someday they will again, which carried the unsaid thesis that my life is a holding pattern with disposable income while theirs is the real marathon that deserves medals and applause, and in the middle of that mix my dad posted a short yes from his corner, which in his language is the equivalent of a hug without the argument, and I sat there reading all of it like an anthropologist in my own family, cataloging the way they pivoted from mockery to audit in under a day, and how quickly the group that said I would not get it turned into the group that needed me to spell out every line item so they could tell themselves a story where I had not somehow outrun them without breaking a sweat. I did not respond right away because urgency is one of the tools this family uses to pull me back into the old choreography where I justify before I act, so I made coffee and thought about what I would have said a year ago. Probably a long explanation about points and a work bonus and a sale I caught and a promise that I am still available if anyone needs me next weekend, and I felt the tug of that explanation like a worn-out sweater I used to put on for comfort. Then I put the mug down and opened the photos again and stared at the image that had caused so much noise, which is funny when you think about it because it was just a dinner list and a glass, not a yacht or a red carpet. Just the proof that I had chosen myself for one evening, and that choice sounded like a dare inside a house where my value has always been measured in how quickly I can show up for everyone else. The first ping after my silence came from my mother, who moved from pride to concern in record time by asking me to call because she did not want me to feel attacked and she hoped I understood that she only wants the best for me. And I could hear the well-worn path she was laying out, the path where she gets to say something slicing and then we calmly reshelve it under the label guidance, and I understood that if I got on the phone I would end up doing emotional cleanup for a mess I did not create. So I typed a single line into the thread that did not ask for permission and did not apologize, telling them that the weekend was a reservation I made with points and overtime from projects I take when they need their family time protected, which means it was funded by all the Saturdays and Sundays I have spent filling gaps so their lives would run smoother, and that I was very comfortable with that math. The silence after that message had a different temperature, not the happy kind and not the stunned kind either, more like a room where people suddenly realize the lights run on a circuit they do not control, and then the replies began. With Melissa getting defensive because she insists she never pressures me and that she always says I can say no, which is technically true in the same way a fire alarm technically invites you to remain calm, while Jason wrote that he thought we were just joking, and that I should not be so sensitive, and my mother, staying on brand, reminded me that families help each other, which would have landed if we were not talking about a one-way highway that has been running for years. I knew if I kept typing I would end up litigating every weekend of the past 5 years, so I did what I came to do and delivered the next clean swing, telling them that going forward I would not be available for last-minute coverage on weekends unless we had planned it at least a week ahead, and that my holiday budget this year would be gifts only and not the extra labor I usually donate, which I framed not as a punishment but as a correction to a system that has been quietly overcharging one person for a long time, and I hit send on that and put the phone down because I wanted the sentence to sit there without my soft edges around it smoothing the corners. That is when Jason cracked and sent the kind of message that says the quiet part loud, accusing me of throwing my child-free life in their faces and of acting superior for having free time and money, which is a wild interpretation of a dinner photo. And my mother followed by asking me to remember that Thanksgiving is about gratitude and togetherness and not scorekeeping, and I looked at those two lines and felt the old pull toward being reasonable, and instead I chose the line I had been saving since Thursday, the one that would make them hear the echo of my mother's sentence the way it sounded in my chest, and I typed that I totally understood if the conversation had become uncomfortable. And that perhaps this thread was for families with children and I would not get it, and while the words were rolling I attached the setting that turned on the album notifications for everyone except me. A small administrative flick that meant their replies would ricochet around them while my phone stayed quiet, and I pressed send knowing I had just put a mirror in the middle of the room and walked away, which is why, when the dots started flying and the calls began stacking up, I let them ring and watched the screen darken. Because the last move of the weekend was not a reply, it was something I had scheduled for the morning that would change who gets to set the terms next holiday, and that, I promised myself, would land without a single raised voice. When Sunday morning came, I woke with the kind of quiet steadiness that only shows up once you have already committed to something and know there is no going back, and while part of me wanted to check the group chat just to see how far the spiral had gone overnight, I stopped myself because I knew the whole point of this move was that I did not need to monitor them anymore, not the way I have always monitored their moods and adjusted myself like a thermostat to keep everyone comfortable while I froze in the corner. So instead I went downstairs, had the kind of breakfast that is prepared by people who do not need anything from you other than that you sit down and eat. And I let the silence of the resort do the talking that I had always been forced to do on their behalf. By mid-morning I was packed, my late checkout secured, and the only thing left was the final note I had been planning since the first seed of this idea took root on Thursday night, because I understood that for a gesture to stick it needs a final nail. Something that seals it so it cannot be reframed later as an overreaction or a phase, and I wanted this to end not with an argument or a justification, but with a sentence so clean that it could not be misquoted without the truth showing through the cracks, which is why I opened the shared album, chose one more photo from the previous evening, and drafted a caption that was not bitter, not smug, and not defensive, but sharp enough to slice through the years of soft-edged explanations I have been forced to give. The photo was deliberately ordinary, just me at a small corner table with a dessert course, no dramatic background and no styled angles, because I wanted them to see that the point was not luxury or spectacle. It was the fact that I had taken a weekend for myself without asking, and that the joy in it did not come from comparison, but from permission I had granted myself for the first time in too long. And the caption I wrote under it was one simple sentence: turns out family is not the only way to live well. Who knew? And I stared at that line long enough to test every possible angle of how it would land, then pressed send and felt the odd relief of letting go of a weight you only notice when it slips off your shoulders. The notifications came in quickly, though I had them muted, so I only saw them in a batch when I chose to look, and the responses were exactly what I expected, with Melissa firing back that I was trying to shame her for having kids, Jason insisting I was rubbing my lifestyle in their faces, my mother warning me about becoming selfish and lonely, and my dad dropping another short yes that carried more honesty than all their paragraphs combined. But instead of typing back, I left it there because the brilliance of this particular revenge was that it required no defense, no follow-up, and no softening. It stood on its own like a line carved in stone, impossible to erase and impossible to deny. And for the first time in my life, I felt that my silence was not weakness, but the strongest response in the room. As I closed my suitcase and called for checkout, I thought about the way my family has always tried to keep me in a corner labeled incomplete, and I realized that by spending one weekend without apology, I had redrawn the map they used to measure me, because now, whether they admit it or not, they know that I can make choices outside their approval and live well in them, and that knowledge changes the air between us more than any shouted argument ever could, which means that when Thanksgiving comes around again and the old lines start to surface, the power dynamic will not be the same, because they will be speaking into a silence that has already proven louder than their noise. I am not naive enough to think this ended the family politics, because families do not flip like switches and resentment is as stubborn as weeds. But what I know, and what they now know too, is that I will not sit quietly in their grading system anymore. And that I do not need to scream or stomp to prove it. I just need to keep living choices that speak for themselves, and that is a kind of revenge that does not burn out. It compounds, it accumulates, and it shifts the balance every time I choose myself over their approval, which is exactly why this weekend was not just a getaway, it was a declaration written in actions instead of words. As the car pulled away from the resort and I watched the notifications pile up without urgency, I let myself smile at the thought that they were still dissecting my caption, still scrambling to figure out whether it was an insult or a manifesto, still trying to pull me back into the debate about whether my life is valid, while I had already moved on, my phone quiet in the seat beside me and my mind focused on the week ahead, where I would go back to work, back to projects, back to my actual life, which they still do not see clearly, but which has always been mine to live. And in that realization, I found the real victory, the kind that does not need applause because it is already permanent. So if you ask me whether I regret not firing back harder in the moment or whether I wish I had delivered some dramatic speech at the Thanksgiving table, the answer is no, because speeches can be ignored and drama can be dismissed, but a move like this, a weekend carved out of years of compromise, is something that stays in their memory whether they want it there or not, and every time they try to remind me that I do not get it, the only thing I will need to do is smile and remember that I already proved I do not need to get into their circle to live well outside it, and that is why, for the first time in a long time, I left a family weekend not feeling small, but feeling taller than the house itself. Because I had finally chosen to stop asking for a seat and built my own table instead.